You're listening to Big Table, a podcast about books and conversation presented by Hat and Beard Press, Dub Lab, and Gold Diggers in Los Angeles. I'm your host, JC Gabel. For each episode, we speak to one author about a singular book in a long-form interview. Each interview is then followed by a brief reading, sometimes from the same book being discussed, sometimes by a like-minded title and a different author. But every episode does retain a loose theme throughout, and is inspired by the work of radio host and oral historian Studs Terkel. Thanks for listening. The myth versus the man or woman has always been a complicated paradox, or a mass of contradictions, especially when it comes to artists and musicians. Vincent Van Gogh is the poster boy for this type of myth versus the man conundrum. Thankfully, we have Van Gogh's letters to his brother, published soon after his death, to hear him in his own voice. One thing we learned from reading his letters is how much of a bookworm he was, and how novels and stories, in particular Charles Dickens, William Shakespeare, Maupassant, George Eliot, and Harriet Beecher Stowe, shaped his life and artwork. Italian art historian and author Mariella Guzzoni has found an innovative narrative arc to revisit Van Gogh's life and times through the books that influenced him. In Vincent's books, Vincent Van Gogh and the Writers Who Inspired Him, published by the University of Chicago Press, Guzzoni writes about Van Gogh's voracious reading habits and how his love of reading inspired his prodigious output over his short but productive life. If one looks, books and references to literature litter dozens of his paintings. Guzzoni's masterfully written and accessible study highlights over 100 works of art, produced in a beautifully illustrated book. Guzzoni and I caught up before the end of 2020 by phone from her home in Bergamo in northern Italy. Here's Mariella Guzzoni. You have sort of tracked Vincent Van Gogh's life through his library and the books that influenced him. But more than most most artists, he's, because of maybe his early death, he's been immortalized in so many myths that it's very hard to tell the mythology from the truth. And I think I learned more about Van Gogh in reading your book than virtually anything else I've ever read about him. And what I also realized was how much stuff is contrary to the myth. And I thought that might be a good place to lead in.
Yes, perfect. You're really right. I mean, people always imagine Vincent as a passionate, impulsive, crazy character who cut off his ear. I mean, an artist who painted in a spontaneous way. I mean, the myth of the troubled artistic genius is really hard to get rid of. Well, maybe people prefer myths. I don't know. Anyway, Vincent's books tells a very different story. There's few artists whose life is so intertwined with their work. In Vincent's case, his dramatic life has often obscured the richness of his work and, the complexity of his work and, of course, his passion for books. So if we read his letters, we have more than 900, we get a total new picture. And we find out that in his life, he read hundreds of books by more than 200 different authors, and that he was a very serious painter, actually, who worked in a precise methodology, and that he was not, of course, the spontaneous artist that the myth has cemented. You know what? There's a beautiful sentence he wrote in 1882 from The Hague. He says, books, reality, and art are the same kind of thing for me. And, okay, I found this sentence beautiful, and what does that mean? That his reading, his life, and his painting are inseparable, an inseparable whole. So, yes, in my research, I've tried to basically to give life and meaning to this phrase, because I find it a beautiful phrase, and to unearth a crucial aspect of Vincent's personality, leaving behind all myths. So I want to say the association art methods, which is so rooted, should be thrown away once and for all. You know what I mean? I mean, so it's really time to leave behind old myths.
The other takeaway from your book was I immediately went and bought the book of letters, which I realized is such a treasure trove into his mindset because he wrote so prolifically, mostly to his brother. Did you notice this thread amongst Van Gogh's life with reading, and that just became, the angle? What made you choose to write a book on this subject?
Oh, yes, this is a great question. I mean, it was really a long path of this. But, I mean, what was striking in my research is that I found out that reading was the common thread in his life. It was kind of a fil rouge with different scopes, of course, according to the different careers that he attempted, art dealer, preacher, or painter, but always with this need to read, to learn. Just think that when he was 20, he worked in London at the art gallery of Gabel & Co. And he suggested some books to his brother Theo. Theo was at the time 16 and worked at the Gabel in Brussels. And what are his reading recommendations? Oh, well, from the Gazette des Beaux-Arts, which was the leading European art magazine at the time, to Jules Michelet or George Eliot, not to mention the romantic and post-romantic English, French, and German poets that he read in their original languages. And you know what? He copied little passages of this for little anthologies for Theo. And yes, what I would like to add is this. A lot is said about Vincent's incredible artistic evolution, over a period of just 10 years. Everyone says, oh, wow. But, from 27 to 37. But in my view, there is no doubt that his lifelong passion for books lies part of the energy and of the creative tension that flows through his art. I could say even a unifying element. And yes, I have in my study, I've tried to visualize for the first time this important theme in his life. It makes a certain impression altogether. So in No Starry Night, No Sunflowers in my book, but Still Lives with Books, or Parisian Novels, or Woman Reading. I mean, these are the works that are under my lens because they're so fascinating, so underexplored that you discover a new Vincent from this perspective.
What I found very fascinating about his reading habits, as you alluded to, was that he was reading a lot of these books in different languages. Now, did he teach himself to read in French and other languages? Obviously, he's of Dutch origin. But with the other languages, like, for instance, was he reading Dickens in English and Maupassant in French?
Yes, he read all the authors in their original language. Of course, he was taught some French at school and at home. And when he was 16, he worked at the Gabel Art Gallery, and he had the opportunity to see many books. And when he went to work in London, he was nearly 20. He, of course, had studied a bit of English. That was a full immersion. I mean, he was very, very good at languages. But what is striking is that Vincent was a radical as a reader. He took things to extremes. I mean, when an author got under his skin, he read everything of theirs that he could find. We have a nice letter to his painter friend Van Rappard, and he says, don't you agree that one doesn't know writers like Dickens, Balzac, Hugo, and Zola until one has more or less full knowledge of the work. I mean, these four authors were without doubt among his favorite ones. And he wrote this letter in 1883, and he had already read all Dickens, all Balzac, and Hugo, and everything by Émile Zola. So hundreds of novels and books. And yes, in these four authors, what is interesting is to think about the common themes. There are common themes in these four authors he mentions in this letter. For instance, the sympathy for the poor, the deprived, yes, of course, the moral importance of literature, and the value of humility, and much more. When he paints the poor and the money, which is a beautiful watercolor, large watercolor, mass of people trying their luck at the Dutch state lottery, or when he draws the soup distribution in a public soup kitchen, but also the potato eaters, what does he has in mind? Well, he has in mind these authors. And more than an influence, these authors, I would say that for Vincent is a conversation. It's an ongoing dialogue. What we must bear in mind is that he always remained an artist reader who dialogued with the artist writer. And in a way, he was inspired, but he was also very much encouraged about this internal dialogue. And yes, there is something very nice that he says continually. And he says that painting and writing are close cousins, because he says Zola and Balzac as painters of society, or Zola painted beautiful townscapes, things like that. I mean, really, there's no difference. Only the tool in hand changes. So this is really what is really fascinating in him, is that there are no real influences, but there is this internal dialogue that goes on always. I mean, as a painter especially.
You mentioned a minute ago those four authors, and all I keep thinking about is how prolific those four authors were, and how many doorstoppers that they wrote. So between Vincent's painting, which again, until I read your book, I kind of hadn't remembered that how close of a time all of this was going on, and most of the work was produced within a decade or so. A lot of the reading that you alluded to was presumably happening at the same time as it lines up with the letters. Did Vincent ever sleep? I mean, it sounds like he was almost like a monk, the way that he produced work, and it's hard to imagine how one would find time to do all of this stuff.
Yes, you're right. Also, I mean, it's incredible. It's a right question. Did he sleep? But I'm sure that he was reading every day, and he was painting every day, and he was drawing every day, and he was writing letters every day. I like to call this a Van Gogh system. He's always connected with everything. I mean, all this was inseparable. He was in solitude, and he really used his time the best he could.
What were the biggest challenges that you had to overcome in your research to identify all these books? Because I think at some point you mentioned that Vincent would sort of absorb these books and then sort of leave them wherever he was staying, and wasn't sort of a collector by any means.
Oh, yes. Thank you for this question. That's a great question. I mean, yes, he was not a collector of books because he left them behind. What was important for him was to memorize them and to have them very, very well impressed in his mind. So in many cases, we don't know which editions were in his hands. Also, the visual aspects really fascinates me. It's an element of my research that was very exciting. In fact, I was hunting for the illustrations of the time in the various editions, Vincent was very attentive to the work of the English and the French illustrators. And then when I found some visual source of inspiration, for example, Mosicada, which is really an illustration which is so small, it's like a postage stamp. And this illustration is in Pierre Loti, Madame Chrysanthème, the novel that inspired Puccini's Madame Butterfly. So the covers of the books of that period were quite delicate. They were not like today's idea of an old book, with just a thick piece of cardboard. They were really just a piece of paper, a little heavier than the pages inside, but not much more. So, very few of those survive today. So, with this in mind, I was hunting for these original covers to add to my collection and trying then to connect this with the paintings of Vincent that show a book cover that I could identify. I just want to make an example so that you have an idea. In the case of Still Life with Statuette and the Rose, which is a Parisian painting of late 87, what do we see? At the center of the composition, we see just two books with wonderful readable titles. One is Bel Ami by Guy de Maupassant. He considered it a masterpiece. And Bel Ami has a blue cover. And the other one is Gemini la Certeux by the Concours brothers, which has a yellow cover. Well, having those two beautiful covers at the center, it's quite a portrait of the new epoch. This kind of detective work I was doing was a long but very exciting process, and it was quite rewarding because when you, maybe these are little things, but they are significant in my view to understand what is behind Vincent's ideas.
No, I completely agree. I think the other thing your book did that I guess was maybe unintentional, or maybe it was intentional in your case, but I went and read some of these books that I'd heard of because they're classics of the 19th century, but I've never read them. For instance, Bel Ami. Yes. One of the nice takeaways from your book is the wormhole that one can go down reading some of Vincent's favorite books and sort of revisiting them after knowing how inspirational they were to him.
Yes, they really they were inspiring for him, really, as intellectually. Vincent knew very well of the political and cultural potential of literary art. And yes, in his life, he even wrote several times that he would have loved to have his drawings and lithographs in the homes of the working class people. Well, what I think this can be a manifesto of his credo in art, of the role of the artist, of the duty of the artist, both Dickens and Beecher-Stowe speak to the common people. The literary art is accessible to everyone. If you think about it, the spectator does not need a special education to appreciate Vincent's art. When you're in front of it, it's so strong. And this is why he's so universal, like Dickens, like Beecher-Stowe. This is really important.
Do you think Vincent ever thought in his lifetime that he would be so revered later on and to be almost on the same level with his own, writerly heroes like Dickens and Zola and Balzac, etc.?
He was aware that he was going much beyond his many of his contemporaries. He wrote sometimes that he wanted to paint portraits for the people of the 20th century. So yes, he knew that his art would last. But yes, what you're saying is too much.
You and I had joked about this when we spoke prior to today. about why isn't there a self-portrait of Vincent with a book in his hand. And I thought that might be a good place to sort of come full circle today.
Oh, yes, this is a nice question also. Yes, we don't know why he never painted himself as a reader. Well, in Paris from February 86, when he arrived, to February 88, when he left for Arles, he painted something like 27 self-portraits in just 2 years. I mean, but never as a reader. Never with a book in his hands or with a book behind him or a book in the background, nothing. But yes, and yet he was really reflecting on this theme in Paris too. I mean, when he arrived, he knew everything about modern French novel, and we can see his enthusiasm for books in a beautiful canvas. The title is Roman Parisien. It's the title that he would choose for the painting, and we know that from a later letter from Arles. And what do you see? You see just piles of books laying across his table. It's incredible. I mean, he posts his books as if they were his friends, like a family photograph. So just in the foreground, there is an open book, just one, and that's him. I mean, it's an invitation for us to read, but in my view, it's a self-portrait. It's incredible.
Vincent's books, Van Gogh and the Writers Who Inspired Him, by Mariella Guzzoni, is published by the University of Chicago Press and is available now in hardcover. For the reading this episode, our author Mariella Guzzoni will read from the Letters of Vincent Van Gogh, published by Penguin Classics. Here's Mariella Guzzoni.
Vincent's letter to his brother Theo, Borinage, June 1880. For example, to name one passion among others, I have a more or less irresistible passion for books, and I have a need continually to educate myself. To study, if you like, precisely as I need to eat my bread. So instead of succumbing to homesickness, I said to myself, one's country or native land is everywhere. So instead of giving way to despair, I took the way of active melancholy, as long as I had strength for activity, or in other words, I preferred the melancholy that hopes and aspires and searches to the one that despairs, mournful and stagnant.
To support Big Table, go to bigtablepodcast.org/bookshop. You can help us and independent bookstore culture at the same time. Big Table is produced and presented by Hat and Beard Press, Dub Lab, and Gold Diggers in Los Angeles, and is supported by Invisible Republic, a nonprofit arts organization based in Chicago, New York, and Los Angeles. You can learn more about their community-based programs and publications at invisiblerepublic.org. Big Table would not exist in the audio world without the expert skill sets, friendship, and dedication of sound designer and editor Matea Bain and audio engineer Jacob Ross. Special thanks to Eric Gorman at Gold Diggers and Alejandro Ale Cohen at Dub Lab for early encouragement and engineering prowess. Thanks again for listening.